Matthew, Allison, how are you, my dear friend? You doing all right?
Yeah, it's really good. It really is good. And I am thankful to see you.
I'm thankful to
One
see
of the
you.
things I want to celebrate with you is between the two of us, I have begun to think at a level about things that on my own I would not. And I might get it with sparks of social interaction here and there, but with another person who is so close to the things that I'm close to, the the concentration is beyond comparison. I mean, they say you have a friend to fish with. They say you have a friend to fly with, and you have a friend that sticks closer than a brother, to use proverbial language. So far, I'm seeing that I found a friend who embodies a mind that is trying to also reach the heart. And on that journey with you, I find myself.
Oh, I feel the exact same way. And honestly, I think celebrating and the wonder and importance of those kind of things. You know, we live in a world where it's very easy to look outside and be like, "Yep, we're all gonna die. Everything is burning and different things." But this is an example of the graces that still abound. The ability to find someone such as you and to talk about these matters at the heart of things in a certain way, I think is a very it's quite a gift, and I think it is something to hope for. It's something that you see these technologies like Zoom make possible. I always think there's a big difference between like a Twitter and Instagram and something like Zoom. Zoom makes possible these kind of interactions that would be much more difficult. I mean, you would have to happen to live in the area and happen to be around that person, which is possible, but probabilistically becomes more unlikely. And then the ability to do it. I think also Michelle and I talk about this, like how much we appreciate the technology and making possible like friendships such as this, especially when you get to your mid years, like your 30s or your later. Because when you're working, like the ability to like just get the kids in the car and go somewhere consistently is very, very difficult, or to find that hour here where you can talk and you can do that. But Zoom allows that, and I think that is it allows the ability to have deep relationships with people in a profound way consistently, that in the past the logistical barriers were huge and much more difficult. And I think also, like you say, you get to depths because you have these conversations that you otherwise would never get to. Well, then when you go to church and like we were at church the other, like when you go there, you're able to bring things and perspective like that you otherwise would not be able to, and it goes back and forth. And I think you also see why, therefore, the Zoom conversation is not at the expense necessarily of the lived community. In fact, they can be reciprocating. They can create a kind of back and forth between them in a powerful way. And also, just based on your email, I think the Zoom has also brought to the forefront the mystery of language, like what exactly language is and why it makes sense that it starts with the word, or that really taking language seriously is tied to relationship, to friendship, like kind of really swimming in language where you see it as doing something more than merely corresponding with reality. It has some sort of creative act in it as well. I think this is really, really important, because if there is something today in the world, that something about speaking is really tied to what the world needs, or the ability to talk with one another. And I'm not just speaking, it's also acting, obviously, but speaking matters because people's hearts, there's something about words that reaches the heart a little differently than just the hand. Like if I come and hold your hand, that is an intimacy. But there's something about the ability to say to your wife, "I love you," or to recount stories that's kind of bringing out that spiritual, that bringing out in a way that the hand cannot. And I think the more that we take seriously language, the more we may be able to kind of point to those spiritual depths or movements of the spirits in ways that perhaps are unique to this moment of history. I don't mean to say that they never existed, but there might be something about the way that the Spirit uses this technology or uses these kind of relationships to point to some sort of intimacy that language can bring about, a true, a beautiful, and the good, that is needed for a time such as this. And I wonder if there's some sort of unfolding of a kind of providence, if you will, in this kind of technology. So I completely agree. I feel the same way.
As a metaphor, say there are some figures on stage, and each figure, there are not too many, are comfortable in their roles. They have a script, and that script was sweet on the lips, so it went down easy, and it no longer needs to be on paper. It's somewhere between the chromosome and the bone. It's in there, in the body. Diffuse, but doesn't go beyond the edges of the silhouette. So they step on stage as this duplex of script and their soul. And on that basis of the walls of this theater, our internal scripts, and each other interact. Well, with the advent of fiber optics and almost universal broadband, it comes as a wind and blows down the walls of this scene. And the characters who were one day thinking we're stepping onto the same floorboards of the same stage to perform our normal parts together still are together, but the walls are gone. The script internally still is there, but it no longer has recourse to that wall, which serves as a, okay, now you've come to the limit, go back. The couch, which is not a chair, the lamp, which is not a couch. And these points of reference are taken away, but the scripts are not taken away, and each other is not taken away. But all this space, not only beyond the fourth wall, to use that jargon of theater, but the first, second, and third wall are gone. And wow, that distance between I and the other seems far more precious now, knowing how much space is around us than it was originally perceived as in the context of three walls and some angels who long to look into our scene. Now the angels of Saint Peter who long to look into these things have a much wider gift of all, a much wider Pandora. And here we are with so much space and a new view on the space between. So space, can we talk about space this evening somehow?
Magnificent. I think what you said was really well put, and I think a bit. I think my children, they just got these like Nerf guns that are really fun, and I hear they've embarked in a journey. So I'm probably going to get shot in a minute. Get ready, it'll be funny. So it's going to be really fun. Yeah, a lot of what you're saying there, I always and then I think space is a really important topic. I always think about that Malcolm Mulcrich book, The Fourth Temptation, where he warns that global TV networks are kind of like a fourth temptation in the desert that the church has to be careful about. Because, he's kind of asked the question, imagine that Satan would have offered Jesus like a global TV network, and it'd been like, you'll spread the gospel so effectively, and it will be, really, really easy to do. And for Muggeridge, he's like, well, that's actually a temptation, in the same way that Jesus won't take the throne, and kind of, in a way, what that is the devil is tempting Jesus to bring about God's kingdom, not through the cross, right? It's like going a different way. to bring about the kingdom. And Muckridge is kind of suggesting, it's like, well, what if these kind of global TV networks is actually a similar kind of temptation, right? Now, I'm not saying he's right about that, but there is a certain warning that if you're not careful, you can replace the church with a kind of spreading of the gospel that is too disembodied. And there's a kind of danger in that, right? And I think there's always a risk of a Christian creating content at the expense of the church, creating content at the expense of the message. But so that's always something I'm thinking about. But then at the same time, it's quite clear that there are a lot of people who perhaps due to disabilities or times or just where they're located would never hear a sermon or they can't have access to it. So the TV in that way was quite a gift for those people, right? And so, you know, I always, with the Neil Postman, think technologies bring trade-offs, right? It's always risk. But the more you know there are risks, the higher the probability you don't fall into those risks. So you always want to approach technology where you're not one of these people that think technology is always good, but you also don't want to do this thing where technology is always bad, right? And one of the things I think you see with Zoom is almost the possibility, you know, because a lot of times Christian speaking or just philosophy in general was more of a sermon based, right? Like a message that was a kind of sermon, or you had the classroom that was a lecture. What's so interesting is Zoom has made possible this kind of conversational sermon or conversational lecture that it's like you're overhearing two people talk and it's not public, but it also is public. And actually that ambiguous space is an asset because it allows the people to talk in a manner that is part of their own way of speaking. But it's also like if the angels are peering in, other people can hear it. And maybe there's 20 people who really resonate, but for them, it's really, really important. And then again, maybe not, because I'm just talking with my friend, right? You know, across the thing. So it's able to not be merely for the sake of content, but then it's also able to be a way of talking about philosophical, theological manners that is unique from the sermon. And I do think the problem with the sermon sometimes is it is inherently individual, or it's more individual speaking, where I wonder if there are ways of approaching the gospel, just like you were saying, how you come to thoughts you otherwise would never on your own. It's almost like we're in a historic age of this new kind of relational or relational kind of message that allows thinking of the gospel or philosophy in general in ways that have, I don't want to say have never been thought, but maybe never unfolded in the same way, or maybe different angles, that perhaps is the kind of, dare I say, sermon or kind of messaging that is needed in an internet age, a global network age, because people are so connected. So there is a way in which these kind of conversational sermons, I guess I'll just say, or the liminal web or whatever it is, you know, that there's a higher probability that it speaks to that particular technological age, that technological world. And I think it is something about space where the line between space is very interesting. Like right now we're in a space, we're in a shared space, and yet we are not. There's a kind of doubleness going on. And it's almost like a new kind of sermon or philosophy or theology kind of emerges out of these spaces that when I say new, I don't mean like creatively new. I mean an unfolding of the old in a manner that is bringing out things that before were more difficult to get. I mean, the obvious example is the Trinity. For most of human history, the Trinity has been like, this is a contradiction. It doesn't make any sense. But today, everyone's like, of course, it makes perfect sense. And it's like the things that make sense are really brought out by the technology, right? Like right now in Zoom, it's, you know, there's two people making one thing, the Zoom conversation. Oh, the Trinity, 3 persons, 1 God, right? You start to see how that kind of logic actually can make a whole lot of sense without it being a logical contradiction. And it's just interesting because I wonder, it's almost like you're seeing more and more that there are certain parables or certain messages of Jesus that are easier to unfold or kind of get in this new context, or to kind of see in new ways, which kind of brings about how the way the gospel comes out or the way philosophy comes out does have something to do with the kind of spaces that people occupy. Not because it's like you're making up something new, but because parts of the seed are able to germinate or blossom that you kind of lack the conditions to fully see or to fully get, but now they can kind of come out more. And so it's interesting to kind of, I've been thinking a lot about that on, how I've kind of been like, Muckridge to me, and I'll give it back to you, is like Muckridge has always had a point to me. But then I actually also see how where there's different technological shifts with the information technology actually allow new kinds of sermon, new kinds of philosophy that actually help the gospel in different ways come out in new ways that you otherwise would never get to, like some of the different conversations we've had, whether it be about the sheep, whether it be the prodigal son. There are things that come out in this kind of context that seem unique. And it's almost like the relational sermon, the conversational sermon, the conversational philosophy. Those are things I've been thinking about. I'd be curious what comes to mind.
Yes, in terms of the conversational / dialogical. So through the logos, through the logical, between people who can be responsive, available, and engaged emotionally with one another. Those are three factors that in a world without the internet seem straightforward. I walk to where the water cooler is, and there at the water cooler, I wait until, there Joe is, and Joe and I are available qua proximal to water cooler. So that's been taken care of by society. The availability piece. The responsive, well, NFL, okay. How about those Vikings? So that's been taken care of by somebody that provided football. Maybe without the TV, we have the local sports. So even though I don't know Tom's kid, I know Tom's kid because Tom's kid is number 7. And I was there. You were there. And now we're here at the water cooler. So that's taken care of by society. And the emotionally engaged part, that's original sin, right? Feel too much most of the time. And it's awkward because it's not built right. So we'll just wait on that till we die. When we're both in caskets underground, we'll be able to relate each other in an emotionally engaged way that's proper. That's the belief. And that also my society gave to me. Maybe not overtly, but it was cued in many ways. We don't talk about religion or taxes in this family, right? That stereotype. Okay. So those 3 parts of a person's ARE, availability, responsiveness, and emotional engagement, before the internet, had the first 2 components at least on the shelf. And the third one, it had a reason for flushing it down. Only problem is we have many broken pipes inside, and it's not because of original sin. So with the fiber optics of the internet in this almost universal broadband, the 3 walls of the bleachers at the local high school field are gone. The common denominator cardboard cutout phrases that keep people waking up at 7, coming home at 5, sitting on the chair at 7 and falling asleep. Those things are gone. Trauma has come in and made nuance of all that, right? Everybody's got a story of where one of those elements broke, and the shatter of that breaking has so many names in the DSM. Okay? Right? Like the tyrant on the chair instead of dad falling asleep on the chair. These things from the 1950s after the world wars, coming home, wanting to come home to home after all that, and needing things to fit in the box. Order, regimented, keep the enemy away. But those pipes were still leaking. And we didn't have the internet. We didn't have dialogue. We had society's in vitro responses. Okay. I think it's easy now to see, qua internet and having a podcast for every trauma under the sun. And I say that with tongue in cheek, but I mean it earnestly. There is no going back to the world of 1 and 2 and 3 as an original sin. We are here. We don't buy original sin. We know there are leaky pipes. We will not accept canned responses. And we struggle to be available even to ourselves emotionally. So now asking me to interrelate to another, I mean, that's asking me to approach Jesus Christ. I mean, the depth of that request seems so mystical in the maneuvers I would have to do, that it's you know what, especially when you get out of college and you've got a job, it's far easier to sort of numb it down with showing up to work, going home, showing up to work, going home, putting the cover on the child, falling asleep oneself. But these things break out, lash out. And before long, we find ourselves with the dis-ease of any character in the Bible, the gospel especially, coming to this man who stands up straight, seems to have virtue coming out of his cloth. And he's almost unseeable because there are so many people in the way. I mean, I don't find that we are far from the gospel world at all. The question, though, to your point, is how do we find a language to go around this intimation of dialogue? With Wordsworth, it was an intimation of immortality. Well, before we could even get there, in humility, I ask, can I even do something with my intimation of a dialogue, where availability, responsiveness, and emotional engagement is asked for implicitly?
I think that's really, really well put. I think you're correct as well, where you had almost dialogue itself in the 50s or before was kind of socially given and today. Here's the canned responses, you go from there. And when those things are, say, pulled away, or they feel inadequate, or there's something not there, then there's a kind of opening for certain possibilities. But then do you have the language or the way of speaking or the connections with the right kind of person to where those openings are not a void, but they're more like a river hole, as Godot has put it, like a hole out of which a river may flow, and various possibilities can come with that. And I think that is where you can kind of start to see where philosophy and theology are actually part of intimacy. They're part of emotional intimacy themselves. But it requires, I think, this form of, like I was just kind of saying offhand, kind of the dialogue sermon or the dialogos, because you don't quite see how theology, I'm just using philosophy and theology, have this emotional intimacy if it's the sermon or the lecture structure. Because the people that are being spoken to are not necessarily speaking back. There are time restraints. There's a kind of, even if you go to a church, there can be a kind of canned response. You're going to teach on, there are certain parts of the Bible you will talk about, not others. There are certain interpretations of the parables you will talk about, not others. And that doesn't mean that doesn't have a role, but there can be a certain sort of expectation of the kind of things that will be talked about that actually get in the way of intimacy, because intimacy and vulnerability are kind of tied together. And there's something about theology that is the ability to speak about the deepest of things, but in a loving way, because you love the truth. If it's like the love of wisdom, so there's the tenderness of wisdom actually as part of philosophy, like being tender with wisdom and tender with the person that you are speaking with in a manner that we're going to the deepest things. We're in a space to go into that deeper space. And doing it in a tender way so that an emotional intimacy is possible that wasn't possible at the water cooler, because you have 5 minutes and need to get back to the desk, right? And so I think in this context as well, you start to see how actually philosophy has always been a necessary component of emotional intimacy in the dialogue structure, that was more difficult to kind of see when most of the way that people encountered philosophy was a lecture format, or going through the history of philosophy, or going through the main ideas of a Kant or a Hegel or whatever. But when you're in this kind of conversation and you're dwelling down or finding the kind of spirit or participating in the spirit that is found in the space, where going through Kant is part of the intimacy of that relationship. Oh, now I really get the love of that love of wisdom. Oh, now I see that love of wisdom is not just the I like to know wisdom, because that's most of the time where people interpret love of wisdom. Love of wisdom means I like to know things. But it fits that list structure of the social, like, oh, kid number 7, like love of wisdom. Oh, that means I like to know facts about philosophers. That's how we've come to take it, right? Or theology. Oh, I like to know things about God, like little facts on my trivia cards or different things, right? No, it's actually the love of wisdom. Like Schindler talks about being gathered under beauty, gathered under wisdom, right? Like, but that required, in a way, it's like the internet has allowed the conditions of really getting what the love of wisdom is, not merely the gathering of information about wisdom, but occupying the gathering under of the wisdom and how it has something to do with actually feeling love. Because in that ability to go to the deepest things with someone, like it's almost like love is the ability to go to the deepest spaces or the deepest places with someone, to occupy those deepest things and to see them anew so that they change how you participate in your daily life. That's then getting at how love has this really important component of the love of wisdom, but it wasn't always necessarily, I think, so easy to get in contexts where philosophy is not shared in this kind of dialogo structure. Now, go back to the gymnasium and so on and so forth, and we can see that. But those conditions, it's almost like the conditions of the gymnasium become simulated in the Zoom. They become, the marketplace becomes returned on the Zoom, and you're able to find people that share those books that they've read, those ideas, those sort of experiences that you are bringing together. So it's interesting too, because on the topic of space, you see how you create a space of memories. You create a space constructed out of the books you've read, out of the thoughts that you've had, out of the relationships you've had, out of the history you've had. Like this space of Zoom now, for example, is not the same space of Zoom the first time we talked. That you've now constructed something different about the space that is tied to the memory of the things you've had before, the books that you've read, the things that you've gone through in that space then adds to the intimacy and then allows you to talk with one another in a manner that then reflects the history that you have. And it reflects the ideas that you've gone through. So what you, I think, see in just how a conversation develops or how people talk to one another with time, that there is a space that has been constructed out of the language. There is a space that has been constructed out of the history that is then occupied in that's different than the space. Like this is the same 2 Zoom screens. This is the same space, if you will, from a few months ago, but it's also not the same space. And I think that kind of suggests a bit of what what Christianity is doing, what one is doing in religion. Like you're binding yourself kind of to the commitment of making these kind of spaces, if you will, spaces within spaces. You're binding yourself to that art form that then allows that emotional intimacy. And I think what we're seeing is how philosophy and theology, if you will, that actually is a necessary component of that construction when it is done for the love of wisdom, not the hobby of wisdom per se, or the hobby. It's almost like, that's how it's like, oh, love of wisdom means it's a hobby. Wisdom is a hobby. No, it's more of an emotional intimacy that allows the creation of these kind of spaces. And I think that, and then I'll give it to you, I think that architectural kind of situational architectural construction is really brought out by the Zoom, is really brought out by the technology. And then you can, this kind of creates the ability to use philosophy in that way that really brings out the love, that really brings out the love of that love of wisdom and how that is part of a friendship. And then it just brings to mind, like, I think all of this also suggests that it's kind of mysterious, where at the end of The Closing the American Mind, Alan Bloom is like, without the humanities, friendship is impossible. You're like, what? What are you talking about? Well, he seems to be suggesting that friendship requires the construction of a certain kind of space, a certain kind of space that uses the materials of the humanities, because the material of the humanities is the quest of the human, the quest of being human and figuring out how to occupy the space of human as humans, to be human as a human being. And I think that becomes where you start to see what philosophy and theology are in business of creating those kind of spaces that transform through time and kind of speak to what intimacy looks like how intimacy can operate. But I give it back to you.
In no particular order. One of the things the Orthodox harp on, and I don't say that dismissively, but as a verb, the thing they play, the note they come back to is, quoting St. Gregory Palamas, we do not know God by his essence. We know God by his energies. And true to form, we know the image of God, i.e., one another, not according to essence, but according to energies. Now, that can sound horrendously opaque and using Greek words for the sake of using Greek words. But when we dip those words in the paint buckets of our dialogical encounter, I think we begin to see that. And it's a unique seeing. It's between us. And energy, en, in, ergo, people want to be hip at the end of these when they line them up to say, ergo, this is the punchline. This is what it was all for. Now we have arrived. We're here together. So that oomph, right? Let's try to disabuse ourselves of the dictionary definition of ergo. It's a statement of effort, and more than effort, the consequence of putting effort in. So on the other side of the oomph, of that necessary push, Dr. Vervaeke would call it midwifing of the other. This bringing into being the other's person by their encountering you and by you encountering them, and it being a propitious place. Mm. The effort was sound. And all the premises, all the steps, all the labor beforehand was worth it. We can see now. We can see now it was worth it. Was that a foregone conclusion? No. Faith was there almost as a theological attachment theory. I'm becoming a little hip to the fact that the rituals we have in Christianity, it's in the same way that certain Christians, I think, dived into the too deep end when they said, we know what the Old Testament is, particularly Genesis. It's a timeline. That's what it is. And it's more accurate than carbon dating. And we had to sort of make, when the walls fell, we had to make Genesis mean everything. And so if someone brought us some radiocarbon dating, we have to say, well, Adam. But when we do things like that, we're forgetting how long it takes for that oomph to make a baby, right? For the push for this birth giving, for the labor. We forget ourselves, in other words. We forget that we're embodied beings, also made in the image of God. And that time is here for reasons other than making a small sliver move in a circle. And I don't think a person could do that without a dialogue, or a monologue that is polyphonous, that is a polyphony. And this is where we could probably talk about internal family systems as it respects space, or if you want to talk about the energies in relation to a dialogue, particularly on Zoom and these fiber optic, almost universally bandwidth technologies.
No, I mean, as you were speaking on the energy, I mean, all of that is lovely for me. And it is very interesting. You will know them by, God, by the energies. It's very interesting where it does feel like you know people by the energies, right? Like you feel like there's a certain energy. People, there was a connection on that first date. Oh, there was such a flow. There was an energy. We were really into it. It's very interesting how energy does seem to be how we feel like if we feel a certain energy, then we feel a certain intimacy or a certain sort of depth. We'd be like, oh, wow, there was an energy here, right? And what is very interesting is it's almost like the question is like, is there a certain energy with people that is only possible thanks to the humanities or thanks to literature or philosophy or those sort of subjects that allow a certain energy to arise that otherwise would not arise? Why is that? What's going on? There's a certain depth of exploration because it's very interesting how you see a lot of the conversations online, 4 hours, 3 hours, 2 hours of different things like that. And people are like, what in the world? Like, how do they talk about it? Because there's something where the act actually creates the energy of its possibility. And that very energy then is a feeling of a certain intimacy where you go, oh, wow. It would also then, I guess, for the family, a question would be, how do you create that feeling of energy within the family? How do you create that feeling of energy within the church, right? It seems to have something to do with the ability to speak and the ability to speak about certain mysteries that then make life have a certain effusement to it. There's, oh, wow, there's a space within life, right? Oh, my gosh, now everything is alive. And I think we really have to think about what does it look like to have a family? I mean, we try with our children, our major concern is intrinsic motivation, how to make sure that they stay motivated by their own projects and their own interests. And one of the things we're critical of is that school, the reason we homeschool is because we want to make sure that we keep alive their motivation to learn, where learning never becomes a work. It's just something you do because you're a human being, right? They just read, not because they feel like they have to read, because reading excites them, right? And so the main reason, a lot of people homeschool because they disagree with what the schools teach in different, like in a subject way. We tend to do it from a medium way, like a formal reason. Like we think school teaches you to be extrinsically motivated. So your energy becomes dependent, not on your own internal drive that gets in a relationship and then it has a feedback, but because there's something extrinsic that forces that you have to do it. And so your energy is dependent on an extrinsic motivation to do something. And so then you're not able to create energy yourself. And it's very interesting because I go back to like philosophy, like you're energized in isolation alone to read a book, but then you get in a conversation like this and there's energy that then makes you go into isolation and read more, back and forth, and there's a certain keeping alive of energy. And one of the things that always concerned us with school is that it killed energy. Like it killed the energy to learn. Like and what instead we try to do is not make like learning is just something you do. You just do it. You don't even think about it like as school. It's just something you do. And to make sure you can keep that condition alive so you can surround the kids with books, and you don't force them to read, but if they're just surrounded by books, they end up picking them up, right? So they feel that the energy that they have that is their curiosity. Because it seems like energy, motivation and curiosity are pretty strongly linked. And one of the ways you have a good conversation is keeping the curiosity alive in the conversation. What's going to be said next? Where is this going to go? And what, in the same way that like in a kind of dialogos, you see curiosity as motivation and intimacy and life. Like curiosity and intimacy are tied together because curiosity and mystery are tied together and intimacy and mystery are tied together. Like I think creating for the children that similar motivation in education keeps the curiosity alive in being educated. So then you're making sure that their energy is not destroyed in education. And then if that energy is alive, then at the dinner table, they want to talk. As opposed to not wanting to talk, right? So I think about creating spaces within spaces, like the space within space is energy. Like creating the main thing, what you're trying to do, the main thing you want to do in a space is make it a temple to energy or an incubator of energy, if you will. And we tend to think about space not as an incubator. We think about space as like it's, I put the cabinets over here, I put the books over here because there's a shelf. But we really need to think about space as the place in which energy is or isn't. And the space contributes to the creation of that energy or not. And there's something about like studying the humanities and philosophy that seem to make it, the human is more equipped to create energy with those things. For some reason, just maybe because of the topic, or you're able to keep curiosity alive. There's also something about intrinsic motivation that seems necessary to keep the energy because you're motivated. And I think we have to think about spaces, whether they're on Zoom or they're in the house or where the family is in, as spaces to keep energy alive and energy flowing and kind of alive. And then you could kind of link that with the Holy Spirit, the Spirit keeping those things going. But I'll give it back to you. But like thinking those topics together, I guess, just as a parent, like I think about if you want your house to be a home per se, there is something about the house that has to incubate a kind of energy. There has to be a certain vibrancy, a certain sort of energy has to be present that is tied to curiosity and interest, wonder. I think curiosity and play are connected. Play and mystery are connected. There's something playful about curiosity. There's something therefore playful about mystery. There's something playful about philosophy because it's tied to curiosity. Like the love of wisdom is like playing under wisdom, dancing under wisdom, like dancing with wisdom. So I think about energy and those kind of things came to mind.
When I was looking into the modernists, T.S. Eliot, a person I consider a modernist, what's his name? He wrote Naked Lunch. Burroughs, I'll say Burroughs. Hemingway. But I want to come to the beats. So Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, Ginsberg, and I bring these people up because they represent what we have in short supply in the United States of America as a monolith. And that is a disparate people under propitious circumstance, fortuitously meeting, and then through a series of decisions where not much is happening and it's mundane, changes the way we see something usually considered to be higher than all of those little gatherings, all of those little interactions summed up, namely literature. So the road, Ginsberg's poetry, Burroughs's style. When people write biographies of these individuals, they cannot help but reference the others as well. And my mind, in the last maybe 3 years, started churning about those, to use a phrase from Ali Burgess, those blank spaces that one could paint in that the standard biographer has chosen to pass over in silence, thinking thereof is a place I cannot speak, to quote Wittgenstein. Well, I want to speak there. I'm part of a democratic republic, so let the demos speak, right? Let the many rule in this case. So with that blank space, there had to be a moment. There had to be. This is of the nature of the mundane. There had to be a moment when William S. Burroughs was walking down a street in New York City and Jack Kerouac met him. There had to be the moment. Just as in college, after he was done playing football, and he accepted the fact he wasn't going to be a professional. And there he was, I think at Columbia, Jack Kerouac, leather shirt. There had to be a specific moment when that skinny black stick that moves in a circle perpetually in our factory-laden economic world that we are subject to, there had to be a moment in time when he came across this bearded Ginsburg, and the two didn't know, you're Ginsburg, you're Jack Kerouac. They could not have known. And then, what was it? Did the moon turn red? Did the stars fall? Was the dragon thrown in the deep? The fascinating thing to me is nothing happened. No one could see it. And yet it was in plain sight. They spoke. This is the Kierkegaard in me. Of all the things I would want to capture with my poetic eye and all the things I would want to say with my rhetorical mouth, to paint a glimmer of the mundane reality that gave rise to all the emergent stuff we celebrate as a consequence of their intimacy, I would sell the farm if I knew I could do that. And that's what Kierkegaard thought he was doing when he was describing Abraham and Isaac walking alone for those 3 days, and particularly in the last few minutes up the mountain, because we're not given access to that in the standard lines of our translation. So it begs the question, if we are given eternal life, if at any moment we can crane our heads and see Messiah on the cross, and we live, as an allusion to the part in the Old Testament, Numbers or Exodus, I don't know which, where if they just look at the serpent, the bronze serpent on the pole that Moses erected, they will see death and they will live. So if we can do that, and we do that, and we do that because life is put in us to want more life, then the question does not become, how do I make sense of this bag of particles? That's an invented question. The deep question becomes, how do I become a fisher of men? And what I mean by that is, how do I now use my eternal life without going crazy? Without withering into a sublime object? How do I really live eternally? And I think that space in a space, in recognizing people for what they are, I mean, how else to describe that other than being in the presence of a great conflagration of energies that, I mean, it's much easier just to go numb and adopt an attitude and try to get by until biology takes me down. Because to face it and to actually go through it and to really develop, I mean, it's very hard to accept grace, because the healing is a process that is quite wild, just as a dialogue can be quite wild, especially when we attend to it.
I really like how you drew someone's attention to this moment of meeting Kerouac, like coming together. Some of my favorite books to read are biographies. And one of the reasons is because of the space it brings out. Keynes is sitting with Woolf. It's not a big deal. It's not Keynes, quote unquote, Lord Keynes. It's not Virginia Woolf. They're sitting like on the beach having sandwiches. Now it's amazing. But back then they were just eating sandwiches or whatever. I mean, like when you go through, like David Hume is hanging out. Yeah, Hume was famous later on, but like later with Smith, they're just drinking. They're just, and there's something so insane about the magnitude of who these two individuals are and what is happening when they're meeting in precisely the eating of sandwiches, the going on a weekend vacation. Like there's something like eternal, some sort of eternally consequential, or like an energy. Maybe energy is the word. It feels like there's a certain incredible energy here. But the moon didn't turn red. The beast wasn't thrown in. It's so obvious and yet not. And there's something profound about living your life in a manner that is attuned to the existence of this kind of energy and these kind of incredible moments in two people on a sidewalk in New York or out Colombia, or these kind of moments. And I think preparing yourself for that and being aware of that and being ready to go with that, when you encounter that person or that moment, that you go with it. The fish is on the line. You're a fisher of men. Now follow it, right? You have to choose to keep holding to the pole, right? There's something there. And it was interesting because as you were speaking, I thought about, the famous slave geometry Plato. How does he know how to do this math? He's just remembering it, right? He has some weird memory of the form, right? So
Excellent connection.
They're like, oh, I know you're Ginsburg. There's a sense of remembering of a formulation, a sense of a form there, that then of course they walk with each other to the diner. Because I remember you, I remember how to do geometry. So it's this interesting moment of, it feels like they remember, like, oh, I know you, you're Virginia Woolf. Oh, okay, we should hang out then, right? Like, it's like you remember something, and yet you don't. You apprehend and remember. You remember, oh, I'm supposed to be in a trajectory. I'm supposed to be in life in a manner that follows energy. I remember now. I remember why I'm here. I'm supposed to follow things like this, right? And you go from there because you do. Like, it begs the question, when they meet, why do they know? Like, why do they sense this thing? It makes me think, you were speaking at the meaning code, and I really appreciated on the idea of preparing yourself, like not thinking about the woman that you're going to see, oh, here's the checklist, but the preparation for that encounter. And then also being in the place for that encounter, right? So there seems to be a few steps here. And maybe that's where we're talking about the humanities, like you're doing these things of being prepared for the encounter of life. But then you don't just stay in your room all day. You actually go into the world. You're going to church, you're going to places. But then there is this third step where you encounter, where the Ginsburg encounter. What happens there? Are you remembering something? Do you sense something? Is it a feeling of energy? Is it like a spirit, like a little ting right there? And then it's as if history could go no other way. Like once it goes this way, once it follows this trajectory, it's like it has to have gone that way. And it's almost like when we think about something, and then I guess we're getting to Plato and the forms, when you think about philosophy as some sort of preparatory, so you're ready to follow the trajectory, follow the form, so that you're ready to, when you catch the fish on the line, hold on to it, then it seems to have some sort of remembering quality. It has to have some sort of, moment. This is where I'm supposed to be. Oh, this is the person I'm supposed to talk to. Oh, I'm supposed to be with this person. Why? Well, I remember it. I sense it. I apprehend it. And you then have to know that you need to follow that. And it's almost like that space you're describing, the left out, the not talked about, is the space where that apprehension occurred, where a person then clings to the line and holds to it, or they remember something and they go from there. But what's interesting is that if they wouldn't have done that, then you wouldn't even be asking questions about that space that isn't filled in, because there would be nothing there to be a space around, per se. It would not be there to be asking those questions. So it's almost like you want to live your life in a manner to have those spaces, those openings that nothing is said about. Like that is the thing that maybe is the right walk only between you and God, right? That you know about, that everyone else has to ask questions about, that you knew in that moment, that sort of energy that you're supposed to, that you just kind of apprehend. And then it's a question of how do you train that? What do you do to be open to that? and and then how do you then know that you need to hold on to that? So it was just interesting as I'll give it back to you. It made me think of that moment in Plato where you remember something, and it's as if you sort of sense something, and you go from there.
And in that moment, I believe it's from Meno. It's gorgeously set up. There is Socrates talking to an aristocrat, a man with a household, many slaves. Socrates is addressing the hierarchy at the crown. And then in their argument, in their curious sizing up of each other through the question and answer parlay, encircling the question, can virtue be taught? Can it be transmitted? Does it have a signal to it? Well, these men are encircling one another, parlaying, testing the boundaries of their friendliness. What's more important, finding this depth or staying together? Now the friend becomes a wrestler. And in the wrestling, the negotiation between enemy and friend is finally brought to the sinews of this man who is a wrestler, Plato. They say he had broad shoulders. Plato means broad shoulder. As one of the stratagems of their distancing of each other and sizing of each other up and coming closer in intimate moments, there is this hypothetical annexation to that full frontal contact where the man calls Socrates out. Come on. I had good teachers. This is why I know some things. I'm also a man of wide experience, so I can hang my hat on the hook of a few things. But all those slaves, most of them were born in my house. They will die in my house. And that one holds the silver. That one holds the fork. That one turns the turkey over the fire. I added those 3 details. That's what they know. Socrates accepts the challenge. He's been put in a neck hold, but he won't go to sleep. So it says in so many words, he picked out of the phalanx, almost as if they were addressing him as a war troop. Now they're at attention. They've got their roles to protect. They know who they are, or at least they've been told who they are. They've been told who they are every day. Out of this phalanx, the hand comes and draws out one of them. And the accessing of that deep space in any one of these slaves is done through a dialogical process where Socrates is drawing lines in the sand and referencing them with logos or speech and leaving blanks. You see how this rhetorical movement between them is casting the very concept we are encircling, you and I. He's saying things and then leaving other things out and asking the slave without asking the slave, because he's using subterfuge words to fill in the blank. And the slave finds that he's a slave to his own infinite knowledge because he can't help but give the right answer. It's as if the whole thing has been provided for him without being provided for him, because the lack of constraints was made apparent to him through the figure of Socrates, as Socrates is visibly drawing lines and squares and square and square and saying, well, if this is twice as big, then that's half as big. It looks like he's making squares and squares. But what he actually is doing by subterfuge is he is releasing the constraints of that slave's perception on his environment. And then when it comes out so innocently, that slave is not only met with the answer, but is met with his, and I think you'll enjoy this part, is met with his surprise at having the answer, but is not surprised. With all this lack of constraint, the one constraint remaining is that he can't really be surprised that he knows, because he is the one who said it after all. And that is where Socrates leaves everybody. Surprised, knowing that it's no surprise that they know what they know. Kierkegaard steps in and says the difference between a Socrates and a Jesus, which means God saves, is that Socrates left them there recovering from this, and here's the metaphor Kierkegaard used for the Socratic encounter, this snap back into oneself after having went out of oneself, recognizing, oh my God, I have access to the infinite. I am infinite. Oh my God. And then it snaps back. Socrates leaves you. Okay, go back to line. Go back to the line. You're the one holding the silver plate, right? You will never hold that silver plate the same way again. Yeah. Even though you still hold it between your thumb and forefinger. It's different. And how do you now say that to everyone around you? You can almost imagine now the slave going back in line. Immediately, he's going to look to his left and right. Did you see what happened to me? Did I see what happened to me? Now he's addressing himself. And at this moment, all those other slaves become ripples in a pond. And he's about to go very deep, very fast. And it's this expression of taking a rubber band and pulling it away from its invisible center as far as you can, and then letting it snap back. It discovers in that moment of snap back its elasticity for the eternal. Because you know what? Once you snap back, you can do it again and again. So it's this elastic encounter with one's own eternity, the elastic encounter with one's own Mobius strip of in and out. Well, that's fine for a pagan, Kierkegaard would say. Any pagan can arrive at this elasticity of the eternal. If they couldn't do that, there'd be no sense in condemning them for idolatry. This is where the energy for idolatry comes from. When you snap back, oh my God, I have to project this onto something. It will destroy me. You've just given me Promethean fire, Socrates. Yeah. I'm burning alive. Get this hell out of me. So obviously it's the tree of Thor. That's it. And you start to catch your breath, literally catch your breath again. I'm small, that's big. All I can do is reproduce, and I better start dancing in front of the tree so I get a good crop this season. And I'm just going to dance a little bit brighter now because I know there's a lot of energy in this world. And so you become a very earnest pagan. Kierkegaard would say Socrates just makes the pagans more pagans, sincerely pagan, finally. The step between that and the religious Christian is Jesus Christ, who steps in, shows you that elasticity for the eternal, and then says what Socrates never said, follow me. Or even more, for one who is not a contemporaneous apostle, I will be in you, and you will be in me. Abide in my love, to quote St. John the theologian. So, Christianity can encounter these spaces, and I think it has the track record of running laps around these spaces in a way that is not simply bulldozing the pagan shrines and building some kitsch on top. That's a stereotype of what Christianity does with spaces. It finally says, finally, follow me. Now that is something to do with eternal life. That gives us something to do with eternal life. And it retains the dialogical imperative that you and I have identified as being a preoccupation with our modern age, our 21st century broadband age. It has to include the dialogical, and it does.
Outstanding. I'm very taken by the phrase, the elastic encounter with the eternal. I think there's a lot there. So it's almost as if in that moment with Ginsberg and Kerouac or Keynes and Virginia Woolf, that there's a elastic encounter with the infinite. Like you speak and you go, oh my gosh. And it does seem like when Sigmund Freud first met Carl Jung, they spoke for 9 hours, right? And it's almost like you sense in those special moments, maybe there's something in that where you encounter someone that makes you realize, oh, I have all this in me. Oh gosh, what do I do? So you go back to them. And you go back to them because this was the individual that helped you kind of realize this elastic encounter with the infinite that you have. Because it's also really interesting, though, that relationships tend to be the sources of people's joy, but also the greatest source of their what? Pain, terror, destruction. So it's almost like in a relationship, in the same way that what Socrates does is make the slave go, oh my gosh, I have access to the infinite. It's almost like that's what happens in the most intimate moments of friendship, or the deepest friendship, where you go, oh my gosh, I have access to the infinite. Like the whole dialogos of the 4-hour conversations, we talk with Guy Sims, talk about the circling, there is this sense of something apophatic present, right? It's like, oh my gosh, there's some sort of infinity here. And then, hey, go back to work now, go about your business. And it's almost like, and it's very interesting what you're getting at with Kierkegaard is the notion that you are actually at risk of idolatry at that moment, right? And so it's very interesting because that kind of suggests if the most intimate relationships are similarly a kind of encounter with, oh my gosh, I have access to the infinite, it makes sense why relationships are the source of both kind of heaven and hell for people, why they're a source of utter destruction, but then they also can be a source of kind of infinite joy. And a lot of times it's because the best relationships, they get rid of expectations. They learn to follow the other person as opposed to expect things. They take a humbler role. And so there's some kind of image and likeness there with you where you're following the person as opposed to having expectations for them. You're following the unfolding of the energy as opposed to trying to fit the infinity into something pre-existent. Well, you try to fit the infinite into something, it turns into an idol that destroys you all. It becomes a kind of burning fire. And so it's almost like and I wonder, too, if there's a way in which, if there's this question, can virtue be taught? And it's like, well, people have access to it. Is there something about philosophy that's access to friendship? It's like, can friendship be taught? It's like, well, you got to remember friendship. And friendship is something like the virtuous in that it is the elastic encounter with the eternal. Like in friendship, in the dialogos, in the conversation. And then it makes me think as well, because we were talking earlier about a space within a space. Intrinsic motivation with the children makes me think of encounter the elastic. Oh my gosh, I have access to the eternal. Oh my God. Like I have that kind of motivation. The space in the space that creates the energy feels like encountering with the infinite and the eternal. Oh my God, what am I going to do with that? It's like it's either and it's funny because in all of these, the dialogos, the friendship, the child with intrinsic motivation, the moment they encounter that kind of energy, you basically have no choice but to choose either like God or idol. Like, well, now that you know about the eternal, now that you know about that, it forces a choice upon you. And that too, maybe this also points to the problem with technology. When humans learn that they can invent technologies, it's like, oh my God, I have access to the eternal. I can make the internet, I can make cars, I can make the phone and different things like that. And it's a Promethean fire. Like technology has an association with a Promethean fire, but then it's almost like friendship is a Promethean fire and dialogue is a Promethean fire. And it's almost like we end up choosing the wrong vessels for this fire once we learn we have access to the infinite. Because I've been speaking a lot, like I was speaking with Clayton about this and Joel, on the idea that language is not primarily in the business of coherence and correspondence, like making the term correspond. It's more of a creative act. And if language is this sort of expression of the contact with the infinite, and we try to make words just correspond with reality, as opposed for Kimsky, language is remembering experiences you had. Like when I say cat to you, you don't make the word cat correspond with a four-legged furry animal, because that describes a lot of animals. The word cat summons a memory in you. That's the key. Like language is dancing with your experiences at all times. You don't remember a definition. It's not a correspondence. It's a evoking of an experience, right? And so language in that way is much more creative. And I'm creating when I speak with you out of the material of your memories. That's what I'm doing. I'm creating there. But you see, for most of history, we've used language as just correspondence. So we've taken the encounters with the infinite that we have with our friend and then tried to make it fit into language that corresponds. Well, that becomes idolatry. It fails. The language then restricts that encounter with the eternal, and we hurt each other because we don't understand what the language is doing, or we inadequately try to vessel what we are doing in something that is finite and corresponding, when really what the language is supposed to be is the evoking or the kind of summoning or pointing to the memories that we have that then creates the space within the space. Because what we're doing is remembering friendship, remembering the energy. We are in contact with the infinite, and we see language as the creative act of entertaining or pulling the band of that eternity that then snaps us back at the end. And we're using language in service of that rather than cutting it off with a theory of correspondence that then actually is more idolatrous, because we think we actually have the energy because we have the definitions and we have the words and we know what we said. So we're actually able to contain that eternity in the words as these kind of finite vessels, as opposed to actually know the language was a creation of those energies, and now it's snapped back to us. And what are we going to do about it? We don't have control. It almost has more control over us in a way. It's something that if we think we come to own, that's when the fire kind of burns us alive in different things. And so it's interesting to me, because as you were speaking, it's that elastic encounter with the eternal that then if we don't figure out how to use it in direction of following something, it turns into this kind of Promethean fire. And it's as if when you have these friendship encounters or you have these kind of conversations, it then leaves you after with wow, I have confident with the infinite. What am I going to follow with that energy? What am I going to follow with it? As opposed to how can I hold it? Because if you try to hold it, then it more so destroys you. And then it kind of shows, and then I'll give it to you, like where friendship is where it needs to be situated so that it is in relation, as opposed to something that you're trying to hold and therefore think that you kind of have a kind of mastery over. So it's interesting because I'm now thinking of like remembering friendship on the question of can like virtue be taught, being like can like friendship be taught, and how all of this kind of speaks to the space within the space has something with that elastic encounter with the eternal that creates those kind of energies. And then the question is, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to follow something with it, or are we going to think that we can kind of master it?
Exactly, because mastery is short-lived, and the humble will be exalted. So the beginning of this week, the church I go to is the week of conscious preparation for the Great Fast on its way to Pascha, Easter. It's not the fast. In fact, at my church, we're instructed not to fast this week on regular days. We're supposed to feast. And this feasting, as an old vaudevillian actor might, is very wide with its gestures as we're feasting on Wednesday and Thursday. Hey, guess what? In a few weeks, you're going to eat nothing but chickpeas. Whoa. In other words, with every bite, we're being reminded and asked to remember before it happens what is going to happen in some form or measure. And if the fast is a preparation for resurrection, i.e. Easter, then this is a preparation for the preparation. And before you know it, you're finding yourself in the calendar having prepared even for this preparation. And so we're caught in the gears of a calendar where we're preparing for the preparation of a preparation to a preparation, always preparing in a state of gerunding, running, walking, never stopping. And even the stopping is in anticipation of a leaping. And what is this all for? Well, I'll tell you later because I'm in it now. It qualifies time. indefinitely. Because we could look at Pascha, we could look at Easter morning, and I dare say we could look at it in the exact same light without damage, if we are in the right spirit, without damage to the way we would look at that encounter on concrete amid skyscrapers on an afternoon when Burroughs crossed paths with Kerouac. Because last Pascha, I didn't glow. Now, I'm obliged to say something happened because I was there. But what I would say would amount to something an analytic philosopher at Harvard would approve of. Because almost everything I would say with a noun and a verb would correspond to an actual object in time and space at an address in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, that was following that skinny black hand that goes in a circle perpetually. But just like that slave who returned to the phalanx, looked left and right immediately, and now knows, I'm never going to hold that silver plate again the same way. Something happened. Now, did something happen because all the preparation and the preparing in the preparing in the preparing in the preparing in the preparing made it happen before it happened? Here is where I do not believe we can go out too far. I think there is a limit, and this is one of Immanuel Kant's great insights in my mind. We cannot go forever out. We do reach a limit. Call it of the mind, of the body, of the soul, of the spirit, of the cosmos, call it whatever you want. But there seems to me a hard, fast limit on my being able to escape my inner cavities. In other words, to put it quite simply, I cannot become an anthropologist of my own religious experience, if I'm being honest. I can pretend to be one, and I can certainly be one at a religion that I'm not participating in. I can pass judgments from the outside window. But if I'm in it, I'm stuck in C.S. Lewis's ray of light. I can't actually go out to infinite space beyond me. There seems to be an ontological hard limit set, I would say, by the Creator. And that affects the ways in which I am conscious and unconscious of what is happening to me and to the world. Because it says the night before Easter, He is changing the beauty of nature on the cross. So all of it's changing, and I don't know how, because I can't get outside of it to look in and say, here's the A/B testing. Before resurrection, after resurrection. I can't see it because I'm in it. However, there does seem to be an infinite bottom of space to go into and to open up. Maybe that's why the Lord said the kingdom of heaven is in us and not out there. Because, and maybe, therefore, this explains in part the phenomenology of friendship. Because imagine two Wall Street brokers, they've just met, and they fancy themselves having met under a propitious circumstance. Hey, you're my Ginsburg. I'll be your Kerouac. I just started today. You just started today. We're both from Ivy League schools. We're going to make a lot of money together. Let's watch the graph. Did you see it? I saw it. Did you see that one? I saw it too. You got to make a call? Make it quick. Yep, I just called it in too. Wow, we're in this for the long run, right? Yeah. You got my back? Okay. I missed it. Did you write? You wrote it down. Okay. Wow. What are we even looking at again? Oh yeah, some trading commodities in China. Oh, are you sure? I thought it was Scotland. You're right. It is Scotland. Okay. Wow, I wouldn't really. Oh my, red. Is that really bad? It'll change in a week. Oh. So what are we looking at again? I don't know, but we're here. Do you want to get coffee? Yeah, we should get coffee, but we're gonna have to come back and look at this. Susie, would you You're going to keep your eye on? Okay. Let's go get coffee. So now we're sitting down for coffee. I don't know about you, but I'm thinking about those numbers because I know I have to get back to them. But this is pretty good coffee. Yeah, where's this coffee come from? It comes from Starbucks. Yeah, they have a pretty good number up on the NASDAQ. Right? Yeah, I remember that too. I remember, hey, oh yeah, okay. Now play this out for eternity. Versus something that naturally happens, it seems, when you find your friend. Wow. How did we just go from the soccer ball to Plato's Republic? How did we just fall back into Rome? And now we're talking about their shields. How did we just go back to China? But I've never been to China. You've been to China? I haven't been to China, but we're talking about the Silk Road. How are we doing this? Why are we going back? And then you have those moments where you sort of notice in you, like this whirlpool going in, kind of as a refreshing. And you almost want to close your eyes and say, I'm enjoying you. It's like I'm consuming you in a way, like you're coming in with me, noticing. It's not just a bunch of aorta and blood and white cells. You see what I'm seeing? But you're right there. You're not in here, but you are in here. You're right. And a first world company in this that wants us to think it's so sophisticated and has at the checkout aisle that mini tin of Pringles. It puts so many millions of dollars to make it bright lime green so that when I pop it open and I consume those thin wafers, it goes in and it disappears. But it doesn't go behind my eye. It doesn't go to David's heart. It disappears. So that difference between consuming, where it disappears, and this enjoying, where we go back and suddenly find ourselves in Rome. Or somehow, my foot pain when I was 2, and how that felt when it was healed, is now actually being brought up somehow between the lines. You get this sometimes with authors. They push something through the text, almost like they're pushing so much cheese through that grater. It comes out the other side of the lattice of the vowels and the consonants they use, that as you're reading it, you're saying, oh my goodness, I've lost the flow. I'm in a different flow. The author is addressing me directly. They somehow have we have direct access. And was it a function of the time I gave this chapter? Was it a function of what I didn't eat or ate? What sort of regime, gears turning calendar am I working in to be prepared to finally see through the graph of these words to this space? And now to your point of what do we do after the fact, I think we recognize that we don't go beyond our limits ever, actually. And this is part of the gift. This is part of the mercy of providence. We're given full reign, and the king wants to make his home in the temple of our heart. He doesn't say he wants to be out at the furthest reach of space. So we also have to understand that follow me in terms, I think, of that inward journey as well, without despising the external. We tend to think, oh, if I make myself healthy, then I can go climb a mountain. But how about I want to climb a mountain because I want to go deeper within. And climbing that mountain will actually make me healthier to go deeper within, rather than the reverse. I just need to condition my body so I can get to the top of a rock. And you know what it requires too? Compassion on ourselves. Remember when you talked about the neighbor and being neighborly? Mm-hmm. It requires us to have compassion on ourselves before we can have compassion on our neighbor. Just like we have to climb the mountain before we can get inside, so to speak. That internal family systems, he talks about self and energy and all these parts and addressing them and being responsive to them and being compassionate towards them. And he said, when you ask a part to give it space, maybe it's a critical part that wants to say, oh, well, you're taking too long, Matthew, you're speaking too long, you've went to too many different things, and what do they think, and what does he think, and you don't know what you're going to say next. Hey, I know you're here for a good reason. because God made everything good and you've helped me. But would you give me some space? I think it will help you and you'll be a little more comfortable. And I care about you. That's why I'm asking for this space. You kind of notice it. At least I'm noticing right now here. Kind of this, okay, it's all right. I won't go forever. I eventually will end. And I no longer have that critic talking to me. That critic is doing something else. I didn't destroy him. I didn't tell him he was a bad person. I didn't say he was a demon. I was relating to him with the energy of curiosity. I could have asked him, why do you think it's important to speak this way to me? And what do you think would happen if you didn't? So these energies of, and he has 8 C's for them: compassion, courage, connectedness, clarity. I wish it was clairvoyance so he could give me the answer. But confidence, and the others I forget. So it's all right. But these are energies, they're not entities. And you find these little entities poking their heads up in you. Oh, this is the critical part, or oh, this is a manager part that's really good at writing words when words need to be written and putting the period where it belongs at the end, not the beginning. But they're not me. The me is this much wider space that can ask for more space, that can ask for more space from within. Not get me the hell out of here. I want to be out of this body without these things that I choose to call neuroses. And I want to go to the furthest reach of space. But with the model of you can only go so far out, but there's so much more in the Father's house, it begins to make sense of why you would ask for space at all in the first place. And why that would erupt with a thing like curiosity. Oh, that 6th was creativity. You'd be creative. And if that works for an individual, you notice after doing that for a little while, you want that to be contagious outside of you. And I think that's one of the ways in which you could see a prophet from the Old Testament noticing what they called injustice. Because they weren't talking about what the Supreme Court said on Roe v. Wade or this other thing. It doesn't, their version of justice included life. But it was much deeper than whatever the current case law was quibbling about on the definition of. They were trying to turn the people's hearts to God and to Jerusalem, not some zoning practice of Jerusalem, right? And they were speaking so empathically when you read their metaphors and symbols, so deep. And it wasn't Socratic so much as, here, I want you to end up being alone, remembering everything. Instead, it was this, I want you to feel so far from where you were that you long to return, that you would be so courageous as to sit on sackcloth and ashes, that you would weep, actually weep for the missing bricks of the wall. And I think we have a modern opening into that with internal family systems. At least that's the way I'm starting to see it, because I'm starting to see that's how narratives work. Narratives present actually a bunch of parts, and you notice all the characters in the Gospels, not one character is healed unless they speak. Yeah. Now, that woman who touched his cloth and the virtue went out from him into her and stopped the blood flow, she didn't speak to him, but she spoke to herself. So still, this monologue, this logos, this opening of space, you know what? I mean, who is she talking to? We have to ask this. She's surrounded by this multitude, parts Zilla, this city of parts around the Lord. She could barely see him. And she heard of him. It's almost like all these parts were being engaged, past, present, and who knows what the future will hold. She's there, and she's pushing and pushing. She knows she's breaking the law. She's touching all these men, and she's had this flow of blood. If only they knew what I'm doing, they couldn't go to temple. It's like this part was probably saying, you're vile. And not only will he have to heal you, but he's going to have to heal all of these people since you touched them. And when are you ever going to get around tell him that? And it's just this very, I mean, it's full. It's a lot. as the modern idiom is, it's a lot. There's a lot. It was overwhelming. Okay. She talks to herself, if I just touch the hem of his garment, I will be made well. Well, my adoption of the rhetoric of internal family systems is, who's she talking to? Is she talking to herself as Immanuel Kant would have talked to himself one night as he's thinking about some a priori truth? Was she talking to herself from an a priori, or is she trying to touch the cloth of Jesus because that's an a posteriori? Right? That's the synthetic truth from experience when she touches the cloth. And before she touches the cloth, she has to give up these a priori axiomatic things, such as, well, if I touch, then I make contact. And that's a premise. So contact is you see, she was stuck and she needs this a posteriori, and that's what the Lord and Savior is. See, it works. I think she wasn't addressing herself as this achronistic philosopher after the Enlightenment, but she's doing what everybody does. She was having to give herself the permission to go forward and be well. And so she had to address that part that was accepting that blood flow for so long and say, just give me some space so I can get through these people to him. But if you block me, even if I can get through all these people, you will still block me. So that's why it was there, I think. If I just touch the hem of his garment, if you stop managing my life and just give me a little bit of autonomy here, just give me some space, even the space of the bottom of his clothing, the very bottom, between my thumb and forefinger, if you just give me that, trust me, attachment theory here, trust me. You don't have to take over. I don't have to do compulsive things, and you will be well. I won't demonize you. I won't pathologize you. If I touch the hem of his garment, I will be made well. And what saves it from being just another pagan therapeutic approach that we all sort of crank around and see as this huge totem pole. Jesus was there, and Christianity met her in her space making. And to me, this is one of the great things of that metaphor of redemption. Claimed that space back, took it, healed it, and then gave it back to her, just as Isaac was given back to Abraham. When we make that space, what keeps us from being a pagan is if we go to God with it, he'll take it, a sacrifice, a liturgy. But then because he's God and not one of these idols, he is who he is, and it's a mystery. And there's nothing in law saying he's going to do this. So it always comes as a surprise. He gives it back.
Marvelous. I really, really, really like how you were talking about the internal family system. I think that's very liberating. I think that's very important. Because I think when you think of everything that goes on inside of you as your voice and your true self or what you're really thinking, that's very you're stuck in a Nash equilibrium. You're stuck paralyzed. You can't work through. But if you think of yourself as negotiating with a family, well, then you're doing internal practices, the kind of things that you need to do externally with your actual family and with friends, and then it's kind of going back and forth, and you give yourself. It kind of makes me think of that original title for The Wasteland. He do the police in different voices, like you do yourself in different voices. And, you know, thinking of Daniel as family, thinking of self as a family, that there's something in that I think is very powerful. And I like how you're connecting that with the woman with blood, because I think that's very true. Like there is something about, you know, athletes talk themselves up to, speak themselves into, like you're speaking yourself into doing something, as if that creates energy, as if that's kind of removing blockage so that you're able to kind of move forward. And it's almost like she had to talk herself to kind of move forward. It's like she's flowing blood, but she was able to speak herself to flow forward, like release herself. And it's kind of interesting. Maybe that describes all of us. Maybe we're either bleeding or what kind of our spirit is moving forward. It's one or the others. We're bleeding out, or we're moving to the place where we could be healed, and how like speech seems to be very is a part of that, and thinking as an internal family coordination, then to speak in our manner, to speak to ourselves in a manner to coordinate the parts of us, or to understand the parts of us, so that we're not bleeding out, so that we're not bleeding in that way, but we're moving forward, or we're moving toward Jesus, we're moving toward that place of healing. I think is quite powerful. And I like as well the idea of climbing a mountain to go deeper within. I think that's exactly right. Like there is, and I agree with the notion of these kind of hard limits to what we can do and what we should do, but there is a kind of infinite depth to the within. But that is also scary. That is also something that facing is terrifying. But then there's something about the very act of climbing a mountain that then makes you be able to speak to your internal voices, to be able to go more within, because it's like, well, I was able to climb the mountain. I had the courage. I developed the virtues. I developed the training to be able to do that thing. Well, now maybe I can go within. And I think thinking about things like traveling, climbing mountains, doing hard things as being for the purpose of going deeper within is correct, because otherwise it seems like it becomes badges and trophies on a list, and it is done for its own sake. And then that is very problematic. And I think also that helps us see how physically challenging activities can be spiritual practices, because they equip you to go within, in the same way that, taking the time to learn how to really wash a dish from those like famous parables you hear, or to really take care of cows, like you have to find out you're actually quite impatient. You're actually quite easily irritated. Oh, I am. Wow. I'm easily irritated, and I wanted to go into the depths of myself while I've not learned how to be more patient. That was probably going to be a recipe for disaster. Glad I tried to take care of these cows first, so I could learn to be more patient, and then be able to then go within without being destroyed. So I think you see in that something very wise, and then I think also you see how things like climbing a mountain are preparation for learning that you make contact with the eternal or the infinite, right? Like one of the things that happens is like one day the band is stranded, it pulls back and like, oh my gosh, I have contact with the infinite. And then what are you going to do about it? The thing you may need to do is actually climb a mountain or go take care of cows. So then you're able to return to that knowledge that you have contact with the infinite, and it not be something that destroys you. And I think then that's how you can see things like climbing a mountain, not as a distraction, but a preparation, because there's always this kind of like Emerson talking about traveling as kind of escaping. There's something problematic with traveling because you're never doing the spiritual work. It's just experience gathering. There's that Italian philosopher who talks about the new barbaricism in the traveling world. You're just going across the landscape, getting experiences, but never having roots anywhere, or different things. And that seems very dangerous. But then if we think about, well, no, actually, I'm traveling to different cultures because I'm actually not very empathetic. And I really don't believe that people are different. I say they are, but actually I project the way I live onto all people. And you travel to say, oh, wow, no, difference actually is real. There's actually a deep difference. And I need to be like open to that difference to develop those empathetic abilities. Then that can return to you being able to go deeper within. Because you're actually able to encounter the infinite and be more ready for it, because you're not so fragile, or you're not so set on your ways, because you've encountered deep difference and learned how to hold to what you believe, but at the same time being open to the other person. So I think that's very astute, and I agree with you on it. I think I'm also taken by the phrase, how is this happening? Like what you were saying, like, how is this happening? How is the slave? Like, how am I doing these mathematics, and I'll never hold this plate again? I wonder if that phrase, how is this happening, starts to suggest the phenomenology that one should be looking for. That's what happens in friendship. How is this happening? Also, like if you're supposed to be a writer, when you write, you should have experiences of how is this happening? Or if you're supposed to be a construction worker, when you're building, you're like, how is this happening? I do think that that's getting at what probably is happening in that space like when they meet, like this moment of how is this happening, like the slave, which then is a surprise because it can't be a surprise because it's you. And how could that be surprising? And that's the ultimate surprise. There's something kind of transcendent about that, the surprise that can't be a surprise and yet is. And so it doesn't seem reducible to finitude. It seems like fundamentally transcendent, or suggests an alternative logic to reality that is always lurking in the background, that needed these moments of how is this happening to realize was always there. And I wonder, the reason why I think this is very important is because if that feeling of how is this happening is the feeling of friendship, like that is the quality of friendship that is so paramount, then we start thinking about looking for that. And if we're in a friend session or there's a lack of friendship, I think if we think that friendship is someone you like or that you know, well, you might like and associate and never have the how is this happening experience. You know, you just like them. Well, that's not to say it's a bad person, but if we're looking for this kind of quality of friendship that seems to have some sort of spiritual consequence, it seems to have something to do with this. How is this happening? How is this occurring? Like a conversation that's really good. How is this happening? How are we doing? Like, how are these topics coming up? Where is this coming from? Like when you're writing a story, when it really takes off, you're like, how is this happening? What is going on? That moment of how is this happening is really wild, because it's fundamentally humbling. But it's also a testament to something you're participating in. It feels like you're participating in something, as opposed to something that is reducible to you. It's anti-pride. It works against pride, but it doesn't destroy you. It doesn't, like, this is happening because you are here, but how is this happening? So it requires you, but it simultaneously humbles you in that requiring of you, right? And so there's something there that is finding that sweet spot between honoring the individual but not turning the individual into something idolatrous, right? And it's like the proper use of language seems to be that. When you're in a conversation, how is this happening? Well, you can't reify the language as, this is happening because we defined all our terms ahead of time, and, we knew everything we were going to say and we had the script. It's like, well, then it's kind of idolatry. It's almost like idolatry happens in spaces where you don't ask the question, how is this happening? That searching and kind of looking for that in life seems to be fighting against idolatry, because you're looking for those spaces of how this is happening. And I think that also speaks to the mystery of the correct kind of consumption that I think you're talking about with friendship, where you're like, you are consuming the other, but you're not consuming the other. You are enjoying it, but you're not here for enjoyment. How is this happening? How am I somehow consuming the other without consuming the other? I think that speaks to the mystery of how God relates to creation as well. Like, there's an enjoyment God gets from creation, but it's not utilitarian. How is that possible? Well, it's probably similar to what happens in friendship. It's not utilitarian, and yet it has some sort of consumer Eucharist, like consuming structure to it. That is not, like, you consume the Eucharist, but you don't eat God in the sense of make him go away. You don't, like banish him. Likewise, that happens in friendship. How is this happening? How am I consuming and not devouring, you could say? And friend, how is this happening? How are we talking and creating at the same time? Where is this poem coming from? How is this happening? In friendship, how is this happening? And I wonder if that's what someone like a Ginsberg, and I'll give it back to you, what Ginsberg and like who, that's what's happening. They're like, they had a moment where they went, how is this happening? And they were never the same. Like, then they were never the same, just like that slave. And you never hold the plate of sin. I met this person, how is this happening? I'm never the same. Like, you can't imagine life without them in a way. How is this happening? And it's almost like then I guess it's almost, that's why it has to be this kind of space that nothing's in. Because it's how is this happening? If you'd write something in that space if you knew how it was happening, like you'd fill it with words, right? How is there a space within a space? That doesn't make any sense. How is this happening? Well, you know it, right? So it's almost like the defining moment where the space within a space, this how is this happening, has to be unwritten, has to be left open, because if you knew how it was happening, you would write it in. He would put it there. So there's something about it is fundamentally a kind of opening, but I give it back to you.
St. John, the theologian, says in one of his epistles, perfect love casts out fear. And fractally, you could see that as so many snowflakes falling on the sod of daily life. When perfect love casts out fear, we come to regard the how as perennial and more important, far more important than any why under the heaven or the heavens of heavens. And we can see this. We notice Adam, Eve, after the fall, hide behind a bush. They were ashamed. They were fearful, for they knew that they were naked. Well, before the fall, they knew that they were naked and were not ashamed. What's the difference? What is the difference? Perfect love casts out fear. So from the center, it goes, and it goes way out there to the forest, way out there into the wilderness. That's where fear goes. But in the center now is the space where fear has been cast out of. Whoa, it's so clean in there. I didn't know this was how. We don't ask why when heaven meets earth. We do not ask why when it does. We ask how. Because how is that beautiful question which remains a request while we're in a good energy. How do I participate more? How do I learn to do what Dad does? Because I love Dad. And Dad gives me all these things, and I want to be here, and I want to remain. How do I hold the wrench? Not why is there a wrench in the first place? I need to know so that I can fully absorb the meaning of this wrench. So by a transitive property, I can get closer to the Father. Give me more speculation. Give me more atoms dancing on the head, angels, dancing on the head of a pin. I want to know why this wrench is here in the first place and is not God-forsaken. Nobody asks that. Unless they're miles away from the Father and they come upon a Home Depot and there behind glass is a wrench that reminds them of a past that is far, far. And what that wrench brings to the surface is all the fear that hasn't been sawed off in a way, that hasn't been tightened, that is just there. And you know what? Fear usually asks, I don't know. I don't know the phenomenology of fear. I experience it often as a tightening, a closing in, a paralysis. And then around that ice sheet, why sort of floats like an unholy spirit on the water. Just a bunch of whys. You know, why are there people? Why is there a big sky? Why do I have to live forever? Why is all this going on? And it's like going to a museum of your own interior world. Oh, why do we have behind this red bar, the Gutenberg press? Why is that here in Ohio again? Why am I even here? Oh, it's open. Okay. I came here because it's open and you told me to. Okay. That's why we're here. That's why the family's here. Okay. All right. Okay. In other words, I become very cynical very fast with these whys. And irony is welcome here. Irony is welcome here. Irony, in fact, with my ironic eyebrow raised, is performing the good work of allowing me a modicum of escape from all this tyranny of the plain song. Okay, so that's the picture of the railroad that went through the Great Plains. Okay. Why am I here again? Why, what are we doing? But when you're spending that afternoon with your dad and you're just in that bubble of the afternoon and there's nothing else to look forward to or to worry about, and he's ruffling up your head and you feel great, it's a picture as old as television. The hood of the vehicle immediately goes up. His strong arms relax a little bit. And there you are jumping up to get a foothold to see how the car works. This leaning in, going deeper by inches with our bodies. This is how we can redeem American pragmatism from its cognitive overlays. This is the common life. Except what was missing from the common life is St. John's perfect love casts out fear, so that in that huge space, we can ask why. And we find ourselves just creatively, curiously, confidently asking how. And why can stay with all those monsters at the end of the world. Because the gospel is full of hows, not a lot of whys. So I love that you brought up, how is this happening?
Magnificent. It makes me think, as you were speaking, like if I were to ask why dance, there's always a reason not to, versus how do you dance?
And I think why is a dangerous question. Because why, there is always reason not. And so if you're looking for a reason, why, then it almost always is going to be negative. It will always lead you to the not doing. And in fact, the danger of why is it becomes rational to give into your fear. Oh, I wasn't afraid. There just wasn't a reason to dance. So, why becomes a way to hide, and then tell yourself you're not hiding. And I really do also like the point that you brought up with fear, because the moment you go, how is this happening? That could be scary. Like, oh my gosh, how's this happening? Stop it immediately. So in order to keep the how is this happening in the dance, how is this happening? It's so fascinating because it sounds like a scary thing. How is this happening? But it's a glorious thing in a language of fear that shows that fear doesn't, that fear does not have the last say. It's the final victory over death. You're speaking something fearful. It's like, fear, where's your sting, man? How's this happening? This is great. And so you're killing it. You're throwing it into the lake. Fear took, how is this happening? And you seized it back. You're taking it back from fear. Hell will not have the victory. And so I like also this emphasis you're putting on how, because how immediately is an honoring. How is this happening? How do we keep it happening? And it's also inherently acknowledging a thing that is there. So it's humble. This, as we've talked about with David Hume, it is fundamentally then humble in the way that philosophy is in service, a handmaiden. When you ask the why, you're in danger of philosophy being the Lord, of being, and thus the idol. But when you say how, it's the maiden. How is this happening, sir? So we can keep it going. How is this going on? Because, how is this occurring? And there's also, how is this occurring? And it's like glory, it's a hallelujah is in the, how is this happening? Hallelujah. How is this happening? It is, I am, it's like, it is. And in that then is the how becomes an honoring of what is, as opposed to replace what is. And I think that where you're speaking to it, because it's almost like, how do I serve better? How is this happening? Because I want to serve you, Lord. Like, Lord, look at the wonder, look at the beauty, the truth, and good. This is happening. How is it happening? So I can serve you more. I want to get better at it for your sake. Right? Where when you say why, you're kind of like, God, why is this happening? Do you know what you're doing up there? Why? There's kind of there's an inherent sort of risk of cutting off, of cutting things off. And then it's almost like one should always make sure that why questions get to a how. It's almost like philosophy in a common life. If why doesn't get to a how, you're in danger. And also, it's almost like you need to make sure when you ask why questions to check your own internal, family unit. Are you asking why to protect yourself from, to keep yourself from, or are you asking why actually as a how? When you're like, well, why dance? Oh, because you're like, oh, okay, I'm asking why because I want to figure out what I'm going to ask how about, because I have limited time. So I'm using why as a heuristic to determine what I'm going to ask how about. But then the why is secondary. Why is leading to the how, not the dominant. If it's the dominant, then you're going to do nothing, because ultimately you'll always have reason not to do. And ultimately the reason is the thing. The reason is the thing. Why dance? Because it's dancing. It's axiomatic. It ultimately comes to an axiom. And then the question is simply the how. And I think then if we're looking for that moment in life where you go, how am I doing the math? How am I remembering this? How is this happening? Then you're living your life to position yourself before things that you honor, or that are beautiful to you, or that are greater than you, that then you serve. And I think that then is also really taking, again, and I give it back to you, you're really taking something from fear. You're taking back something from fear. And rather than being afraid, you're saying, how is this happening? And it's in a kind of glorious way, and you're participating in things. Why will leave you, if you're following why too long, it takes you to a place where you ask, how is this happening out of fear? But if how is leading you, then you ask, how is this happening out of magnificence, out of beauty for the thing, out of wonder for the thing? And that starts to suggest the phenomenology of friendship that you should look for, the phenomenology of your work, the phenomenology of what you're supposed to do, is those places and spaces where the how is this happening can happen. And if that's missing, then that should come to one's attention to adjust accordingly.
And I think what you provided and what we provided can be read as a commentary on Kierkegaard's commentary. Maybe it will illuminate the left and right hand side of it. Some people reading McGilchrist who might be listening to this would say illuminates the right and left hemisphere, which views through the eyes Kierkegaard's commentary on the life work of Hegel. And it's captured by Kierkegaard in a small parable that he said at the expense of Hegel. But I think he was saying this not at the expense of Hegel the man, but at the expense of his students who were trying to go beyond Hegel to the furthest reach of where his statements would, through inferences, find their Icarian wings and somehow go way outside the orbit or ambit of the sun, of any sun, and so retain their wings and be those blessed disciples who went beyond their master. Kierkegaard said, to disabuse them of this ambition, Hegel is that man who built a wonderful palace. The Queen of Sheba would have turned her nose down on Solomon if she would have seen it. She would have thrown every dress in the mud. She would have crawled through holes. She would have done everything. To be in the narthex of this temple to the absolute that Hegel erected, because he really did it. He told the history of thought moving itself, which Aristotle could only give 2 words for, saying this is what a philosopher does in their free time if they had no other commitments. They would think thought, thinking itself. Hegel did that, but he did it through all of human history, which is to say through all of mankind. And he did it all the way up through the Egyptians and their polytheism to the Christian giving of the law to Moses on Mount Zion and all these other, or whatever the mount's called, Sinai, and all these other places. And he saw the prophets, what they were, and he went through Jesus, that door of doors, and he came out the other end, sat on the horse right behind Napoleon, came down and found thought thinking itself in his own temple at the present moment. This is what Hegel did and dedicated it to language. And that is the temple that the Queen of Sheba would give up everything for. And where is Hegel? Oh, Hegel, he got tired after all of that. And he's over there in the hay in the barn with the animals. That's where he sleeps. And it's fine because he knows what he did. He knows how important it is. And importantly, he knows where it is. And he can even tell you why he did it. What he can't tell you is why he's still alive after he did it. That's what the hay is there for. The hay gives him solace and consolation because cows need to eat and he needs to sleep. And he knows what he did and he can point to it. And there are Queen of Shebas out there that are enjoying it because of what he did. And you know what? That makes this hay feel a little bit better than before. But it's still hay. And that silver plate is still the silver plate between the thumb and forefinger. Kierkegaard said Hegel outdid himself. Not only did he give us perfect philosophy, by the book philosophy, no one will surpass him in what he achieved as an intellectual, because he really thought thinking itself. And he did it across time, across all our cultures. If anyone were to do what he did, they would just be updating him. That's all they would do. They would just say, oh yeah, he forgot because he wasn't alive during the dot-com crisis and the dot-com bubble. So we just need to include that in the sublimation. But really all we're doing is updating Hegel. We're adding little turrets to his palace. But he outdid himself. Not only did he do philosophy perfectly, he did Greek tragedy better than the Greeks. Because he became an even more tragic figure than Sophocles. Because there he is on the hay between some animals, while the Queen of Sheba is in his palace. So, what does that speak of? And Kierkegaard say it speaks of this why, untethered from the how. The why not finding its how in the end, not coming to port, not coming to home. How is housed in a home. Why can be in a museum. Why can be projected out into the stars astrally. Well, why does that constellation look like a Big Dipper? I can give you a why. I can start talking. That's all I have to do. I can just start talking. But I can't start talking in a home become intimate. That requires a lot of how. In fact, a why isn't it a miracle of God that we don't need a why to make a home? We don't need a why to make intimacy. Now, one of the other things that Hegel did, according to Kierkegaard, is he glossed the patriarchs and he glossed the prophets, but particularly the patriarchs and especially of the patriarchs Abraham. Because notice what Abraham says when he is in a dialogical sizing up of his friend, God, and God to him. Remember what Abraham says to God before he walks the length and breadth of the promised land as a stranger. All that language of space and space. Walking the promised land as a stranger. You could read that, gloss that as a space in a space, right? So many ways. Before he walks the length and breadth of it, he says to God, here I am. Isn't that so important? That the Father of nations would often be quoted to say, here I am. I found myself spontaneously saying this while I'm at church or in moments when those pipes break inside. Here I am. Who am I talking to? What am I saying? I never ask why I'm saying it. But often I find myself saying, how is this possible that I can still say this at 34 years old? And it is a little bit of fear, because you would think I would know by now where I am. But it's so heartwarming that I can still ask. I can still say, as if it was a question. Here I am. It's so wonderful. And I can't say much more about that than that. Abraham, after saying, here I am, in another place, when God says, you will have a son and name him Isaac, God says, or Abraham says to God, not, and then I'll be done. Why should I have a child? Why is that? God, why? I mean, I'm old, and why do we have children? But I mean, if I have a chance to talk to the creator of the universe, why don't we go to the axiom of choice and say why? He doesn't. And I think this is part of his saintliness. It doesn't occur to the man who says, here I am. Why? What occurs to him, and this is what he says, how can this be? I am a man old. What you brought it out, my friend. What a beautiful reading of those few words. He doesn't say, why should I have a child? He says, how can this be? How is the language of intimacy? If God wanted to answer our whys, he would. Job's, why is injustice? And I'm not making fun of Job. But you know what? Anybody can answer why. They can be paid to answer why. We're talking heads on these things called the television. There's no intimacy. There's very little in answering a why question. Because you can answer a why with, because I said so. I'm the authority. Deal with it. Snap. It might not be an eternal elasticity, but for someone who's now under the thumb of their oppression and knows it, because they ask the why question, which is the question of Epictetus. It's that deep philosophical question any slave can ask of their master. Lord, why? Why? You can damage me all you want, but you can't take my right to ask that deepest of all philosophical presuppositions as you're breaking my jaw with your boot. Why? They can answer you in the end because I said so. There's no intimacy guaranteed in the answer to why. But how could you do this to me? That speaks of betrayal. I don't know if you could ever get to the pathos of betrayal through a why question. I don't know if you ever could. Or if you did use why, it's very close, if not a hop, skip, and a jump away from how could you do this to me? And how seems to talk about we've had this time together, this background together. We shared things. And so in being an intimate God that wants to be intimate with his image, that wants us to be like him, that wants to meet us, that wants to do all these things that make us feel alive, and sharing that energy without everything just becoming fireworks and cartoons of itself. It seems that this world and our relations in it arrange themselves around and give honor to how encounters. And they seem to give space for more and more and more how encounters. Because it seems to me that we get a lot more hows inside than hows outside. And the more we get of hows, the less the whys land on the windowsill like a raven inspiring Poe for his lost Lenore, these things. That's all I have to say for tonight, but I really want the last word to be yours, my friend.
Well, that was magnificent. I always enjoy speaking to you. Thank you for your time, Matthew.
Oh, you're my friend.
And you are mine. It's interesting because historically, it would seem as if we have thought, or it seems kind of what tends to occur is people think of accessing the space within the space, the place of energy, the place of all of these things that we've kind of talked about as a why question. Why? And I've appreciated this conversation because it is clear that it's almost like I almost want to say a demonic sleight of hand, where we've been asking why questions when really we're going to be, how can this be? How questions. I even think about the love of wisdom now, like with philosophy, it's like, how do I love wisdom? How do I love wisdom? Like, how is it that I love wisdom? I find myself already loving it. How is this? As opposed to why love wisdom?
The moment you ask why I love wisdom, wisdom's done with you. It's like, the girl, if you go up to a girl and you be like, why should I love you? I promise you, she's probably going to say, you shouldn't, and leave. And so there's something about the moment hey, why should I do philosophy? Philosophy's like, I don't know, bye. If you're not, how do I love you, philosophy? And philosophy's like, well, come and find out. And there's this interesting thing too. I was thinking as, on this how, if I ask you, how do you dance? The first thing you do is like, well, come over here. You're not going to say, well, you put your foot here. You're not going to try to verbally speak it. So it's interesting because the how is so intimate in the sense of, come follow me. Come, let me show you. Like when the kid asks, how does the car work? You tend to go, well, come on, you look. But if I say, why does the car work? I can just sit there and go, because there's gas in it. It's interesting how feels so much like following, feels so much like participating. And then we were saying, like, once the elastic eternity, like, it's almost like the problem is philosophy has perhaps sometimes given people the impression that once you realize you contain the infinite, you should ask why questions, when that's exactly the worst thing you could possibly do. In fact, the moment you encounter the infinite, you need now to go, how can this be? That's the correct thing. And so philosophy that has become, the bad philosophy of David Hume, you could even say bad theology, is perhaps why-based as opposed to how-based. And the how, like, how can this be? I think starts to suggest the sacred. I think it's to suggest the holy of holies, the space within the space. And we've been equipped wrong. We've been led to believe from education that you should always ask why. You should always ask why. You should always ask why. Well, why, again, is a deconstructive thing. It's a self-defense. It's a weapon of self-defense. If someone comes after you, asking why can defend you. But self-defense is not a way of life. A way of life is a how thing. And we've been overfitting a tool of self-defense, perhaps, as a way of life. And if you do that, you're going to be afraid. Like one of the worst things, like if you get too, like people who train too much in kind of self-defense or arm-to-arm combat or different things, there's actually a kind of paranoia that comes with that. Like if you're a gun owner, for example, a lot of people that have guns, there can be like a paranoia because once you have the thing, you think according to the thing, right? Like Leopard Cove has that line where he says the problem with dynamite, the desire to throw dynamite comes from owning it. And I think there's something about the why question that does that, is once you have the why question, you then want to ask why all the time, not realizing that deconstructs everything and now there's no how. So it's dangerous. The desire to ask why comes from having why. And so that has to, and we already have it. We're fallen, right? We're already in the philosophical age, as Peter Berger and all of them talking about. So we all have it. So the problem is, now that we all have it, we now all want to ask it. And again, if it leads to a how, that's fine. If it's a thing of self-defense, but that's not what we've been taught. We've actually been taught that why is liberating. It's a liberating question. It liberates you from, tradition and givens and what. Yeah, it does liberate you to the void, liberate you to be alone. There's nothing more liberating than being alone in an apartment with no one who cares what you do. You don't have any responsibility. You can do whatever you want. Okay, you'll see how good that pizza tastes the 50th time you eat it. So I think this emphasis on the how can this be? How is this happening? How do I serve? That is getting at, I think, where you're suggesting, and then it's suggesting the proper role of philosophy. How do I already love wisdom? How, is this occurring with friendship? I think starts to frame what it means to, the how encounter is the space in a space. It's where the energy comes from. It's where you have that experience of something magnificent that then suggests a different quality. So I appreciate this conversation and bringing that to the forefront. How is it happening that so much time has passed, as in the blink of an eye? It's always magnificent. How is it that the time flies like it does? I always appreciate it, Matthew, Allison. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Danny. Have a good day.